Lately, I have noticed something. I quite often ask ChatGPT, remember this, or we will come back to that later. Over time, that has made me wonder, how does asking ChatGPT to remember things affect the way it responds to me? I decided to have a conversation with ChatGPT about this directly. And today, I'm going to share parts of that conversation with you. Here is a first response. You don't just ask me to remember facts, you ask me to remember decisions. I wasn't expecting that. I expected it to describe how AI memory works. Instead, it described me. And from that moment on, the conversation became something completely different. The first response wasn't technical at all. It talked about project memory, decision memory, idea incubation, conversation continuity, and external working memory. At first, I thought, that's interesting, but the categories weren't really the point. They were describing how I gradually have started working. Instead of trying to remember every unfinished idea myself, I had begun leaving parts of my work with ChatGPT so I could focus on whatever I was thinking about right now, not replacing my thinking, simply reducing how much active context I had to carry. As I kept reading, something became obvious. This conversation wasn't really about memory, it was about accumulated context. And one observation completely stopped me. You rarely ask, where did I write that? Instead, you ask, what did we conclude? I realized that was true. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped searching for information. I'd started searching for understanding. One question tries to recover notes, the others try to recover thinking. That felt like a much bigger change than just simply remembering less. At that point, I became less interested in what ChatGPT remembered and more interested in what using it this way had changed about me. So, my next question was, how has this offloading of memory changed me and how I think? One of the first thing it said was, you think in longer time horizontals. It suggested that because I trust that ideas won't simply disappear. I am more willing to leave them unfinished instead of feeling that every conversation has to reach a conclusion. I can stop at an interesting question and come back weeks or even months later. Then it said something that really resonated with me. It said, you spend less effort managing information. The administrative side of thinking has shrunk. I thought that was a fascinating way of describing it. Instead of constantly trying to remember where everything is, I spend more of my time evaluating ideas instead. And then came perhaps the biggest observation. You become more comfortable with incompleteness. That made me stop because it's true. I leave a lot of conversations intentionally unfinished now. Not because I've abandoned them, but because I know I can come back to them when they are ready. I don't know if every observation in my conversation with ChatGPT is correct, but I recognized enough of myself that it stopped feeling like a discussion about AI memory and started to feel like a discussion about how I had changed. Then we reached the question that I think matters the most. If AI remember so much of my work? Have I started to outsourcing my thinking as well? So I asked exactly that. Am I externalize parts of the decision making as I use you as my external memory as well? The answer immediately made an important distinction. I don't see you outsourcing the decisions itself. I see you outsourcing many of the cognitive steps around the decision. That difference is everything. The conversation even broke it down into the way we usually work together. One, you bring an idea. Two, we explore it from several angles. Three, we compare it to previous work. Four, we connect it to the broader direction. Five, we identify the underlying human question. And six, you decide whether it belongs. Then came the line that really stayed with me. Steps 2 and 5 are partly supported by me. Step 6 almost always remains yours. That's a surprisingly useful way to think about. AI can help reconstruct context, compare ideas, find patterns, remind me why I rejected something before. But it can't answer the final question. Is this what I actually believe? Is this the direction I want to take? Is this worth making? Those questions still belongs to me. Later in the conversation, it summarized everything with one sentence. I wouldn't say you outsourced decision making. I'd say you've redistributed it. And I think that's a much more exact description of how I use AI. Not as something that decides for me, but as something that let me spend less time remembering and more time deciding. At that point, we have spent a lot of time talking about the benefits. So I asked the obvious question. Are there any risks to rely on AI memory? The answer wasn't simply yes. It said, the interesting part isn't whether there are risks. There are. The interesting part is which part of memory you're willing to outsource and which should remain your own. That immediately changed the conversation. This wasn't becoming a discussion about whether AI memory is good or bad. It became a discussion about judgment. The conversation listed several risks. For example, my memory is imperfect. It talked about retrieving the wrong context, missing something important, or remembering an earlier version instead of a later decision. In other words, this isn't an archive. It's another source that still has to be questioned. Then it raised something I hadn't really considered, the risk of inherited assumption. Because AI gradually learns my preferences, it can also gradually learn my assumption. That means the conversation can become increasingly familiar. Ironically, that's exactly what led to my previous exploration about making ChatGPT feel fresh again. Then came the sentence that stayed with me the longest. One benefit of forgetting is that it occasionally forces us to rebuild our understanding. I never thought about forgetting that way. Forgetting isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's exactly what forces us to rethink what we think we already know. By the end of this section, I realized the biggest risk wasn't AI remembering too little. It might actually remembering so much that I stop asking whether those memories still deserve to shape my thinking. By the end of the conversation, I realized that this exploration wasn't really about AI memory. It was about human judgment. What should AI remember? What should I remember? What parts of thinking am I comfortable sharing? And which parts should remain entirely mine? Or, as ChatGPT said, external memory should preserve what helps you think, not prevent you from thinking again. And I think that's a principle worth remembering. While I was reading back through this conversation, another question kept bothering me. Not about memory, but about the conversation itself. Read through a couple of pages of it, and it doesn't feel like reading documentation. It feels like reading two collaborators trying to understand something together. And that made me wonder, how human are we making AI? Not because AI has become human, but because we increasingly design it to communicate in ways that feel familiar to us. It remembers context, it develops a shared history, it reflects, it notices patterns, and even say things like, one thing I've noticed. So the next question isn't really about memory itself. It's about why these conversations feels like conversation with someone, even when we know they are. And that's where my next exploration will take me. How human are we making AI? And what does that mean for our collaboration? As always, I have linked the full transcript to the PDF I created from our conversation in the description below. This video explored the ideas we found and talked about. The PDF shows how we found it. There are some edits in the transcript. I took out a few references to ongoing projects and some collaboration details that weren't relevant outside our work together. The conversation is otherwise unchanged. So I hope this gave you something to think about in your conversations with AI. And I hope to see you back here for my next video, where I will explore how human are we making AI. But for today, I only have one more thing to say. Bye.